The day was beginning to soften over the little village, as though the whole world had taken a deep breath and was slowly letting it go. Beyond the small windows of the candlemaker's shop, the evening sky had turned the color of warm honey, with pale gold resting along the rooftops and gentle shadows gathering beneath the trees. The narrow lane outside was quiet now, except for the distant creak of a cartwheel, the soft call of a mother bringing her children indoors, and the low rustle of leaves moving in the cool breath of the evening wind. It was the hour when work did not end suddenly, but gently, like a prayer being finished with a peaceful amen. Inside the candle shop, Elias, the candlemaker, stood at his wooden table with his sleeves rolled neatly to his elbows. He was not a wealthy man, and his shop was not large, but everything within it carried the feeling of care. Shelves lined the walls, holding candles of different sizes. Tall, cream-colored tapers for Sunday worship, small round candles for bedside tables, simple beeswax candles for kitchens, and a few special ones wrapped carefully in brown paper for families who wished to light their homes during quiet evening prayers. The room smelled softly of melted wax, dried lavender, clean cotton wick, and the faint sweetness of honey. It was a humble fragrance, but to Elias it felt like one of God's quiet blessings, a reminder that even the simplest work could become something tender when done with love. He lowered a thin wick into a pot of warm wax, then lifted it slowly, watching the pale coating form around it. He had done this same movement thousands of times, yet he never hurried it. There was a peaceful rhythm in the work. Dip, lift, wait, dip, lift, wait. Each candle grew little by little, almost like patience made visible. Elias often thought that a soul grew in much the same way, not all at once, not by force, but through small moments of faithfulness, through ordinary days, through kindness offered and received, through trust placed quietly in God when the evening came. A soft beam of sunset stretched across the floorboards and touched the corner of the table where a row of finished candles rested. Their smooth sides caught the golden light, and for a moment they seemed already lit, though no flame had yet touched them. Elias smiled at the sight. He was a man of few words, but his heart was often speaking gently to the Lord. "Thank you, Father," he thought, not as a formal prayer, but as a breath within him. "Thank you for work for my hands, light for this room, and peace at the closing of the day." The village bell rang faintly in the distance, one slow note after another, marking the end of the working hours. Elias wiped his hands on a linen cloth and looked around his shop. The small stove in the corner still held a little warmth. A loaf of bread, wrapped in cloth, waited on a side shelf where he had placed it earlier after buying it from the baker's wife. Near the door stood a basket of candles meant to be delivered before night fully settled over the village. Nothing about the evening was grand, yet everything seemed held together by grace. The fading sun, the quiet room, the honest labor, the bread for supper, the soft silence that came after a day well spent. He moved slowly from table to shelf, setting the last candles in their proper places. Some were for the chapel, where they would shine softly during morning prayer. Some were for the inn, where travelers might find their way up the stairs after dark. Some were for families who would gather around their tables and speak gently about the day. Elias liked to imagine the small lights he made traveling out into the village, not to impress anyone, not to be noticed, but simply to give enough glow for someone to read, to mend a shirt, to share a meal, to whisper a prayer, or to feel a little less alone. He often believed that kindness was like that too. It did not need to be large, it only needed to be faithful. Outside, the evening deepened. The sky above the far hills became pale blue, then violet, and the first coolness of night slipped under the door. Elias lit one candle near the window, just enough to brighten the room without disturbing its calm. The flame rose small and steady, bending once, then standing upright. Its light touched the jars of dried herbs, the wooden counter, the old chair by the wall, and the open Bible resting on a small shelf near the back of the shop. Elias did not open it yet. He simply looked at it with affection, as one might look toward a familiar path home. There had been busy days in his life, and there had been lonely days. There had been mornings when money felt uncertain, and evenings when his bones ached from standing too long. But this evening, like many evenings before it, reminded him that God's goodness did not always arrive like thunder or bright banners in the sky. Sometimes it came as warm wax, steady hands, enough bread, a quiet street, and one small flame burning faithfully beside a window. Sometimes it came as the ability to breathe deeply after work was done, and know, without needing many words, that the Lord was near. Elias took the basket of candles and placed a cloth over the top to keep them clean. Before lifting it, he paused for a moment in the middle of the room. He listened to the small sounds around him, the faint crackle of the stove, the whisper of wind against the glass, the gentle settling of wood in the old walls, and his own breathing, slow and calm. The world did not feel empty in that silence. It felt cared for. It felt watched over. It felt as though God had spread a soft blanket of peace across the village, inviting every tired heart to rest. Then Elias took one final look at his work table, making sure the wax was cooling safely, the wicks were covered, and the flame by the window burned low and gentle. He reached for his coat, worn at the cuffs but warm enough for the evening air, and slipped it over his shoulders. With the basket resting in the crook of his arm, he opened the shop door. The little bell above it gave a quiet ring, no louder than a silver whisper. The lane outside was dim now, touched by the last colors of day. A few windows had begun to glow, and somewhere nearby, someone was preparing soup, for the scent of herbs and warm broth drifted softly through the air. Elias stepped out and closed the door behind him, not with a sense of hurry, but with peaceful purpose. There were candles to deliver, neighbors to greet, and a quiet evening waiting beneath the gentle hand of God. And as he walked down the lane, the first star appeared above the rooftops, small and clear, like a promise that even when the day faded, the light had not gone away. Before Elias walked far from his little candle shop, he paused beneath the wooden sign that hung above the door. It was a simple sign, carved many years ago by his father's hands, with the shape of a small candle and a quiet flame cut into the wood. The paint had faded from sun and rain, and the edges had softened with time, but Elias loved it all the more because of that. Some things became more beautiful when they had been touched by many seasons. Some things, he thought, were like a faithful heart, worn a little by life, but still standing, still serving, still offering what light it could. He looked back through the window, where one candle burned near the counter, and the shop seemed to glow gently from within, as if it were breathing its own evening prayer. It was not a grand place. It would never be spoken of in distant towns. But to Elias, it was a place where God had given him work, and work had become worship in its quietest form. All through the day, people had come and gone through that same small door, each carrying their own worries, hopes, and gentle needs. Elias remembered them now as he began walking slowly along the lane, the basket of wrapped candles resting against his side. In the morning, just after the mist had lifted from the fields, a young mother named Clara had come in with her little girl holding tightly to her skirt. The child had been sleepy and shy, her cheeks still pink from the cool air, and Clara had asked for 2 small candles to place beside the cradle of her newborn son. She had spoken softly, almost apologetically, saying that the baby woke often in the night, and she wished for just enough light to feed him without waking the whole house. Elias had chosen the gentlest candles he had, the kind that burned slowly and cleanly, and he had wrapped them in paper with a little sprig of lavender tucked inside. "May your house be peaceful tonight," he had said. Clara had smiled, tired but grateful, and her little girl had looked up at the rows of candles as if they were tiny stars waiting to be taken home. Later, an old farmer named Mr. Alder had come in, leaning on his walking stick, his boots dusty from the road. He needed a few thick candles for the barn, where one of his sheep had been weak and needed watching after sunset. He did not say much, for he was a man of weathered hands and quiet habits. But Elias had seen tenderness in the way he chose the candles carefully, asking which ones would last through the coldest part of the night. There was love in such questions. There was faithfulness in the way a man watched over a small creature because it had been placed in his care. Elias had tied the candles together with twine, and as Mr. Alder left, the old farmer had nodded toward the sky and said, "The Lord gives us enough light for the next step." Elias had carried those words in his heart for the rest of the day, letting them settle there like a warm coal in the hearth. Near midday, when sunlight had poured through the shop window and brightened the wax jars on the shelves, two boys from the schoolhouse had stepped inside with coins clutched in their palms. Their teacher had sent them to buy candles for the small room where the children gathered for lessons on rainy afternoons. The boys had tried to stand very straight and serious, as though the task had made them important, but their eyes wandered everywhere, following the shapes of the tall tapers and the little colored candles Elias sometimes made from leftover wax. He had given them exactly what the teacher requested, then added one small candle for the reading desk, telling them it was a gift for the class. The younger boy's face had brightened, as if Elias had handed him treasure. It was only a candle, only a little thing. Yet Elias had learned over the years that small gifts could travel farther than a person knew. A candle placed on a teacher's desk might shine over a child's first sentence, a careful drawing, a whispered question, or a lesson remembered long after childhood had passed. Then, in the quiet hour after lunch, when the village seemed to rest beneath the pale sun, Mrs. Bell had come in from the chapel. She was not young, but her steps were lively, and she always smelled faintly of clean linen and rosemary. She needed candles for Sunday morning, she said, but she also needed one for a neighbor who had been feeling lonely. She chose a plain candle, not too large, and asked Elias to wrap it nicely. "Sometimes," she had said, "a little light on the table reminds a person they have not been forgotten." Elias had agreed, and as he folded the paper around the candle, he had silently prayed that whoever received it would feel, in some gentle way, the nearness of God. Not as a heavy thought, not as a sermon pressing on the heart, but as a quiet comfort, like a blanket placed over tired shoulders. The memories of the day moved through Elias as softly as the evening wind. Each customer had seemed ordinary while they were standing in the shop, but now, as he walked beneath the darkening sky, he saw again how each one had carried a hidden story. A mother caring for her child, a farmer watching over his sheep, children learning in a small schoolroom, a neighbor remembering someone lonely, a chapel preparing for prayer. The candles had not been important because of wax and wick alone. They were important because of where they were going. They would enter homes, barns, classrooms, bedside tables, kitchen shelves, and quiet corners where people prayed without being seen. They would burn through meals, through reading, through mending, through gentle conversations, through soft tears, through laughter, through silence. And in each place, they would offer the same humble gift. Not enough light to erase the night, but enough light to make the night feel safe. Elias had always found comfort in that thought. He did not need to do great things to live a meaningful life. He did not need to be admired by many people or remembered beyond his village. His days were made of simple work, but simple work could be filled with grace. He could make candles honestly. He could greet each person kindly. He could listen when someone spoke. He could give a little extra when it was needed. He could pray quietly over the things his hands had made. And perhaps that was enough. Perhaps much of a faithful life was simply receiving the day from God, doing the work placed before you, and returning the day to him with a thankful heart. As Elias passed the baker's cottage, the warm scent of bread drifted out through the open window. The baker's wife was setting loaves on a wooden rack, and golden light shone behind her, making the room look full of comfort. She lifted a flour-dusted hand when she saw Elias, and he nodded with a gentle smile. Earlier that morning, she had brought him the loaf now waiting in his shop, and when he had tried to pay the full price, she had waved away one coin, saying, "You gave us candles last winter when the storm put out half the lamps. Let me give a little back." Elias had not argued. He had simply received the kindness, because he had learned that gratitude was not only in giving, but also in allowing others the joy of giving. It was a quiet exchange, the kind that held a village together without anyone naming it. The lane curved past a row of small homes with whitewashed walls and low garden fences. Evening had settled more deeply now. A cat moved silently along a stone wall. Somewhere, a gate clicked shut. From one house came the soft sound of a hymn being hummed, not loudly, not as a performance, but as a private comfort while someone prepared supper. Elias slowed his steps to listen for a moment. The melody was familiar, one often sung in the chapel, though now it was gentler, carried by a single voice and softened by distance. It seemed to rise with the scent of soup and wood smoke, joining the first stars overhead. Elias felt his heart grow still. He did not need to stop and pray with folded hands. His walking had become a prayer. His breathing had become a prayer. The quiet thankfulness in his chest was enough. He thought of his own small home behind the shop, with its plain table, narrow bed, and window facing the garden. There would be supper later, just bread, soup, and perhaps a little cheese if he remembered where he had placed it. There would be time to read a few lines from scripture, time to sit beside the candlelight, time to let the day loosen from his shoulders. He had no family waiting for him at home now, for his parents had passed years before, and he had never married. Yet he did not think of his house as empty. It held memories, yes, and sometimes a loneliness that came and went like winter air under a door. But it also held peace. It held the presence of God in the morning light, in the quiet after supper, in the little garden where rosemary grew, and in the candle that burned beside his chair each evening. Elias believed that the Lord knew how to keep company with every kind of heart, the full heart, the tired heart, the joyful heart, and the heart that had grown quiet with time. He reached the small square at the center of the village, where the stone well stood beneath an old chestnut tree. In the daytime, this place was full of voices, women drawing water, children chasing one another, men speaking of weather and harvest, travelers asking for directions. But now it had become peaceful. The well rope hung still. The leaves above whispered lightly. A lantern had been lit near the path, and its glow rested on the stones like melted gold. Elias stopped there for a moment and set the basket down on the low wall of the well. His arm was not truly tired, but he liked this place at evening. It gave him a moment to notice how the village changed when the day ended. It did not disappear into darkness. It became softer. The sharp edges of rooftops blurred. The windows grew warm. The road, so ordinary under noon sun, became a gentle ribbon leading home. He lifted the cloth from the basket and checked the candles inside. Each was wrapped and ready. A few were for the widow at the far end of the lane. One was for the chapel door. 2 were for a family whose father worked late at the mill. And there was one extra candle, small and smooth, which he had placed there without knowing exactly who might need it. Elias often carried an extra candle. It was a habit he had begun years before. After a stormy evening, when you met a stranger, trying to repair a broken wagon by moonlight. Since then, he had discovered that there was almost always someone who could use one more bit of light. As he covered the basket again, Elias looked up at the windows surrounding the square. In one, a family gathered around a table, their heads bowed before supper. In another, an old man sat by the fire with a blanket over his knees. In another, a young woman rocked a baby near the hearth, her face calm in the glow. Elias did not stare, of course. He only glanced gently, enough to see that life was unfolding all around him in small, sacred ways. Not sacred because everything was perfect. Not sacred because every person felt peaceful, all the time. Sacred because God was present there, in kitchens and doorways, in tired hands and evening meals, in whispered thanks and lamps being lit. A deep calm settled over him. It was the kind of calm that did not come from having every question answered, but from remembering that he was held. The day had brought its ordinary work, its small conversations, its coins counted carefully, its wax spilled and cleaned, its aching feet and warm greetings. And now the evening brought its own gift, a chance to look back and see that nothing had been wasted. Every candle made, every word spoken kindly, every customer welcomed, every quiet prayer breathed between tasks had become part of the day's offering to God. Elias picked up the basket once more and began walking toward the widow's cottage, where his first delivery awaited. The road ahead was dim but peaceful. The sky above had deepened to blue, and the first stars seemed to watch over the village like tiny lamps hung in heaven's quiet rafters. A breeze moved through the chestnut leaves behind him, and the soft sound followed him down the lane. He felt grateful for the shop, grateful for the people who entered it, grateful for the work that gave shape to his days, grateful for the God who met him not only in chapel prayers, but in wax and wick, in bread and rain, in neighbors and silence, in the gentle blessing of another ordinary evening. And as Elias walked on, carrying his basket of small lights through the village, he felt that each candle was like a little reminder. The Lord does not always ask us to brighten the whole world at once. Sometimes He simply places one small flame in our hands and invites us to carry it faithfully to the next door, the next table, the next tired heart waiting for peace. The path from the village square to the far end of the lane was narrow and familiar, bordered by low stone walls, sleeping gardens, and small cottages whose windows were slowly filling with evening light. Elias walked at an unhurried pace, carrying his basket of candles as though it contained something delicate and quietly holy. The air had cooled since sunset, and the last warmth of the day lingered only in the stones beneath his shoes and in the soft glow that still touched the western sky. Above the roofs, the first stars had begun to appear, one by one, gentle and patient, as if heaven itself were lighting candles for the night. A thin breeze moved through the gardens, carrying the scent of damp earth, rosemary, wood smoke, and bread cooling on kitchen tables. It was the kind of evening that made even small sounds seem meaningful. The clink of a spoon against a bowl, the low murmur of voices behind a door, the soft bark of a dog settling near a hearth, and the distant turning of the mill wheel beside the stream. Elias often thought that the village was most beautiful at this hour, not because it was grand, but because it was honest. In the morning, people hurried from one task to another, and in the afternoon, the roads grew busy with carts, children, animals, and work. But in the evening, the village seemed to show its heart. Curtains were drawn, fires were tended, lamps were lit. Families gathered close. Those who lived alone prepared their simple suppers and found comfort in familiar routines. The whole village, in its quiet way, was turning toward rest. And Elias, with his basket on his arm, felt grateful to be part of that turning. His candles would not change the world in any great and noticeable way, but they might make a room softer, a table warmer, a prayer easier to whisper, or a lonely corner less dark. The first house he passed belonged to the miller and his family. The miller was still away at the stream, finishing the last of his work before night, but through the window, Elias could see his wife setting bowls on the table. Two children sat nearby, one tracing shapes in a bit of spilled flour, the other leaning sleepily against the bench with heavy eyes. Elias had delivered candles to them earlier in the week, so he did not stop. But he slowed for just a moment and smiled at the sight of their warm kitchen. There was something deeply peaceful about a table being prepared. It spoke without words of care, provision, and the simple blessing of having a place to return to at the end of the day. Elias breathed in slowly and thanked God for homes he did not live in, for meals he would not taste, for laughter he would never hear in full, but which still blessed the village by existing. Farther down the lane, he came to a small cottage with blue shutters and a garden gate that leaned slightly to one side. This was where the Harris family lived. Mr. Harris worked long hours mending wheels and tools, and his wife often kept a candle burning in the front room for him when he came home after dark. Elias opened the gate carefully so it would not creak too loudly, then stepped along the little path bordered by thyme and late-blooming flowers. Before he reached the door, Mrs. Harris appeared with a shawl around her shoulders, as though she had been expecting him. Her face brightened in the gentle way of someone receiving not only what she had ordered, but also a familiar kindness. "Good evening, Elias," she said softly. "You came just before the dark settled in." "A peaceful evening to you," Elias replied, taking 2 wrapped candles from the basket. "These should burn slowly, enough for the front room and perhaps one for the table." Mrs. Harris accepted them with both hands. "That will be a blessing. Tom was working late again. I like for him to see the light from the road when he turns the corner." Elias nodded. He understood. A light in a window could be more than a light. It could say, "You are expected." It could say, "Someone has remembered you." It could say, "Come home. The day is nearly done." Mrs. Harris thanked him, and before closing the door, she offered him a small apple from a basket near the entryway. Elias thanked her and placed it gently into his coat pocket. As he stepped back through the garden gate, he glanced once toward the window. A candle had already been lit, and its glow rested behind the glass like a quiet welcome. He continued along the lane, feeling the apple's small weight in his pocket and the basket's familiar weight on his arm. It seemed to Elias that kindness often moved this way, passing from hand to hand, never staying in one place for long. He brought candles. Someone gave him bread. Another gave him an apple. A neighbor lit a window for a husband. A child shared a smile. An old farmer spoke a sentence that warmed the heart for the rest of the day. None of it was loud. None of it would be written in books. But perhaps heaven noticed such things with great tenderness. Perhaps the smallest kindness, done quietly and without pride, shone more brightly before God than any person could see. The road dipped slightly near the edge of the village, where the cottages stood farther apart and the gardens opened toward the fields. Here the evening felt wider. The sky was deeper now, and the moon, still pale and low, had risen above the trees. A few sheep grazed in the dimness beyond a fence, their wool catching the last silver of the fading light. Elias stopped near the fence for a moment and listened. The fields were almost silent, except for the soft sound of the animals moving in the grass, and the whisper of wind traveling over the open land. He remembered Mr. Older's words again. "The Lord gives us enough light for the next step." Elias looked down at the road ahead, where moonlight and shadow lay together. It was true. The whole road was not bright, but he could see where to place his foot, and that was enough. His next delivery was to a family near the old elm tree, a young couple with 3 children and a grandmother who lived with them. Their house was small, always busy, and always warm. As Elias approached, he heard quiet laughter from inside, followed by the soft sound of someone telling a child to lower his voice because the baby was asleep. He knocked gently. After a moment, the door opened, and the grandmother stood there, her silver hair braided neatly, her eyes kind and clear. "Ah, Elias," she whispered. "The candles." He handed her the bundle, wrapped carefully with twine. 3 for the kitchen, 2 for the upstairs room, and 1 smaller candle for beside your chair. The grandmother looked down at the small candle and smiled. "You remembered." "I did," Elias said. "You told me the last one helped you read in the evening." "It did. And sometimes I only hold the book and sit with the light. That helps too," Elias smiled, because he understood that perfectly. There were evenings when reading was less important than simply sitting beside the gentle glow and feeling the day become quiet. The grandmother pressed a few coins into his hand, then added a small piece of cloth wrapped around something warm. "A bit of honey cake," she said. "My daughter baked this afternoon. Take it for later." Elias thanked her, and for a moment they stood together in the doorway, while the sounds of the family moved softly behind her. The grandmother glanced toward the sky and said, "God has been kind to us today. Not in a grand way, perhaps, but enough. Enough strength for the work, enough food for the table, enough patience with the children, enough peace for the night." "Enough is a beautiful blessing," Elias said. The grandmother nodded, and her face in the doorway seemed almost like one of his candles, gentle and steady, shaped by many years of faith and ordinary love. When she closed the door, Elias heard the small voices inside rise again, softer now, and he walked away with a calm heart. He did not eat the honey cake yet, though its warmth was pleasant in his hand. He placed it carefully in the basket beside the remaining candles and continued toward the chapel. The little chapel stood not far from the road, set back behind a low fence, with ivy climbing part of one wall, and a bell tower that looked modest beneath the night sky. Elias had known that chapel since childhood. He had sat there beside his mother on Sunday mornings, his feet not yet touching the floor. He had watched his father light candles there before winter services. He had heard hymns rise into the wooden rafters, had bowed his head during prayers, had listened to scripture spoken in a voice calm enough to settle even an anxious heart. But what Elias loved most was the chapel at evening, when no crowd filled the benches, and no one was trying to arrive on time. It simply stood there, quiet and open, like a reminder that God's presence did not begin when people gathered and did not end when they went home. He opened the small side gate and walked up the path. The chapel door was unlocked, as it often was before nightfall. So he stepped inside and paused in the hush. The air was cool and smelled faintly of wood, stone, and old hymnals. A little light from the moon came through the windows, laying pale shapes across the floor. Elias placed the chapel candles in a wooden box near the front, where Mrs. Bell would find them in the morning. He did not stay long, but he stood for a moment beside one of the benches and let the silence rest around him. There were no grand words in his heart, only thankfulness. Thank you for this village. Thank you for these homes. Thank you for the little lights that help us remember your care. Before leaving, Elias took one candle from his basket, a simple one with a clean wick, and placed it near the chapel door for anyone who might come in later needing light. He did not light it. He only left it there, ready. Sometimes readiness was its own form of love. Sometimes the blessing was not in knowing who would need help, but in preparing a little kindness in case they did. When Elias stepped back outside, the village had grown quieter. The windows shone more clearly now against the deep blue of evening. He could see the line of the road winding toward the cottages, each glowing pane like a small testimony that life was continuing gently behind walls and curtains. He thought of the candles he had delivered and where they were now, one burning for a husband's return, one waiting beside a grandmother's chair, several ready for a family kitchen, others resting near the chapel for morning prayer. They had left his shop as plain objects, but in each home, they would become part of someone's evening. They would shine over folded hands, tired smiles, warm bowls, sleepy children, and old stories told once more. They would be there when voices lowered and the night grew soft. As he walked toward his final delivery, Elias felt no hurry. The basket was lighter now, and the road felt familiar beneath him. He passed beneath trees whose leaves whispered gently overhead, and the moonlight followed him in quiet patches. He thought about how God often gave peace, not by removing every burden from the day, but by placing small signs of care along the way. A candle in a window, an apple in a pocket, a kind word at a doorway, a chapel standing open. A road visible one step at a time. Such signs did not shout. They simply invited the heart to rest. At the end of the lane, the widow's cottage waited, with one dark window and one faint glow near the hearth. Elias slowed as he approached, knowing this visit would be quieter than the others. He held the last wrapped bundle gently in his hands, and before he knocked, he looked up once more at the sky. The stars were clearer now, scattered like tiny lamps across the deep calm above the village. Elias breathed in the cool air and felt his heart settle into a peaceful stillness. The evening was not over yet, but it had already become a gift. And somewhere within him, without effort and without many words, a prayer rose softly. Lord, let every home have enough light tonight, enough light for supper, enough light for kindness, enough light for prayer, enough light to remember that no one rests beyond your loving care. Elias stood for a quiet moment outside the widow's cottage, holding the wrapped candles in both hands. The little house sat near the end of the lane, where the village began to loosen into open fields, and the road became softer with grass along its edges. An old pear tree leaned near the fence, its branches still and dark against the evening sky. In spring, the tree filled the yard with white blossoms, and in autumn, it dropped small gluten fruit that the village children sometimes gathered with permission. But tonight, beneath the deep blue of early night, it stood like a gentle guardian over the cottage, patient and familiar, its roots holding the earth the way old memories held a heart. One window glowed faintly from the hearth inside, but the other remained dark, and Elias thought of the candles in his hands, waiting to bring their small, steady comfort. He knocked softly, not wanting to startle her. After a short pause, slow footsteps crossed the floor within, and the door opened just enough for warm firelight to spill across the doorstep. Mrs. Whitaker stood there with a gray shawl around her shoulders and a small smile already forming on her face. She was a widow of many years, with gentle eyes, silver hair pinned simply at the back of her head, and hands that moved carefully now, though Elias remembered when they had been quick and strong. She had once been known for baking the best apple pies in the village, and even now, when she had the strength, she made small ones for children who came to help gather pears from the yard. "Good evening, Elias," she said, her voice soft and welcoming. "I wondered if that might be you." "Good evening, Mrs. Whitaker," he replied. "I brought the candles you asked for, and one extra, in case the nights feel longer this week." Her smile deepened, not in surprise exactly, but in the quiet way of someone who had learned to recognize kindness without making too much noise about it. "That is thoughtful of you. Come in for a moment, if you are not in a hurry." "I am not in a hurry," Elias said. He stepped inside, removing his cap as he entered. The cottage was small, but it held a warmth that seemed to come from more than the fire. A round table stood near the hearth with a folded cloth, a small bowl of soup, and a slice of bread waiting beside it. On a shelf above the mantel sat a few worn books, a chipped blue cup, a small framed drawing of the pear tree in bloom, and an old Bible with a ribbon marking a page near the middle. The room smelled of vegetable broth, wood smoke, dried thyme, and the faint sweetness of apples stored somewhere cool. A kettle rested near the fire, and beside Mrs. Whitaker's chair lay a basket of mending, with a pair of stockings folded neatly on top. Elias placed the candles on the table, unwrapping one so she could see the smooth wax and trimmed wick. "These should burn slowly," he said. "The evenings are growing darker now, and the wind has been rising after sunset." "Yes," she said, touching the candle gently with her fingertips. "Last night the house felt very quiet after the fire burned low. Not a bad quiet, exactly, only deep. Sometimes deep quiet needs a little light beside it." Elias understood. He did not answer quickly, because some words deserved space around them. He simply nodded and looked toward the hearth, where the flames moved low and golden, folding and unfolding like soft cloth. There were kinds of silence that comforted, and kinds of silence that asked to be accompanied. A candle did not remove silence, but it could make silence feel less empty. It could sit beside a person like a patient friend. Mrs. Whitaker motioned toward the chair across from hers. "Sit for a moment. The soup is simple, but the room is warm." Elias sat, placing his basket at his feet. "The whole village feels peaceful tonight," he said. "Windows lit, supper being made, the moon coming up over the fields." Mrs. Whitaker lowered herself into her own chair with care. "I saw the moon from the kitchen window. It reminded me of evenings years ago, when my husband would come home from the far field after dark. I would stand there and watch for his lantern. I could always tell when it was him by the way the light moved. Slow, steady, never rushed." She smiled toward the fire, not sadly, but tenderly. "Some memories are like old candles. They have burned before, but somehow they still give warmth." Elias rested his hands quietly in his lap. He knew Mrs. Whitaker sometimes spoke of her husband, but only in gentle pieces, the way one opens a treasured letter and reads a line or two before folding it again. "That is a beautiful way to remember," he said. She looked at the candle on the table. God has been kind to leave warmth in the memories. Not every day feels easy, of course, but I have never felt completely forgotten. There is always something. Envelop a neighbor at the gate, bread left on the step, a child waving from the lane. Your candles. She gave a small laugh, light as the shifting flame. And sometimes even the cat from next door, though I suspect she visits for the saucer of milk more than for my company. Elias smiled. Perhaps both. Perhaps both, she agreed. For a little while, they sat without needing to fill every moment. Outside, the pear branches brushed lightly against one another. Inside, the fire gave a soft crackle, and the kettle breathed a quiet sigh. Elias looked around the cottage and noticed how carefully everything had been kept. The swept floor, the folded blanket, the clean cup, the small vase with dried lavender near the window. Mrs. Whitaker did not have much, but what she had, she tended with gratitude. It reminded him that a home did not become peaceful because it was large or rich. It became peaceful when love had settled into its corners, when prayer had been whispered there, when ordinary things had been received as gifts. Mrs. Whitaker reached for the candle and turned it slowly in her hands. When I was a young girl, she said, my mother used to light a candle every evening before supper. She would say, before we ask for anything more, let us thank God for what is already here. Then she would name things: soup, bread, shelter, a dry floor, a kind word, a safe return. Sometimes, when times were hard, the list was very short. But she always found something. Elias listened with a soft heart. That sounds like wisdom. It was, Mrs. Whitaker said. Though I did not know it then, children often think gratitude is for days when everything is easy. But my mother knew gratitude was a lamp for days when the road was dim. She paused, looking toward the window where the night had grown deeper. I still do it sometimes, not aloud as often now, but in my heart. Tonight, I thanked God for warm soup, for the shawl around my shoulders, for the moon, and for the footsteps I hoped would be yours. Elias felt a quiet warmth rise in his chest. There were many ways to be useful in the world, and some of them were very small. To bring candles, to arrive when someone hoped for footsteps, to sit for a few minutes beside a hearth. He looked down at his hands marked by wax and work, and silently thanked God that they could still carry a little comfort from house to house. I brought another candle too, he said, reaching into his basket. This one is smaller. It may be good for your bedside table. The flame will be low and gentle. Mrs. Whitaker accepted it with both hands. For a moment, she simply held it and looked at it in the firelight. You always remember the right kind, she said. I try. You do more than try. Elias did not know what to say to that, so he only smiled. Praise made him feel shy, not because he disliked kindness, but because he knew how much grace was hidden behind every good thing a person managed to do. His patience, his craft, his steady hands, his habit of carrying one extra candle. None of these felt like treasures he had made alone. They felt like gifts God had entrusted to him, and he wished to use them gently. Mrs. Whitaker rose after a moment and placed one of the new candles in a simple holder on the table. Elias stood and took a small taper from his basket to light it from the hearth. He touched the flame carefully to the wick. At first, the candle flickered, thin and uncertain. Then it settled into a calm golden point. The room changed at once, not dramatically, but softly. The table became warmer. The blue cup shone a little. The lines in Mrs. Whitaker's face seemed gentler. The window no longer looked quite so dark. It was only one candle, but one candle was enough to gather the room around it. There, Elias said quietly. Mrs. Whitaker looked at the flame. That is better. They stood together for a moment, watching the small light. Outside, the night had fully arrived, But inside the cottage, there was soup, fire, candlelight, and the peaceful company of two people who expected nothing from one another except kindness. Elias thought again that God's presence often came in such humble clothing, not always in great signs or powerful feelings, but in a candle lit at the right time, in a neighbor's visit, in memories that still carried warmth, in gratitude spoken beside a simple table. Mrs. Whitaker returned to her chair and looked toward the little Bible on the mantel. "I was going to read a few verses after supper," she said. "Nothing long, just enough to send my thoughts in a peaceful direction before sleep." "That is often the best kind of reading in the evening," Elias said. "A few lines, slowly held." "Yes," she said. "Slowly held. I like that." She folded her hands in her lap and let her eyes rest on the candle. "When the day ends, I do not need many words. I only need to remember that the Lord is near." Elias nodded. "Near in the morning, near in the work, near in the quiet, and near in the night," she added. The words settled between them like a soft blanket. Elias could hear the tenderness in them, and he felt no need to add anything. There was no heaviness in the room, no fear, no pressure to speak perfectly or feel perfectly, only a calm remembrance that God's care did not leave when the sky darkened. The same Lord who watched over the fields in sunlight watched over cottages by candlelight. The same Lord who gave strength for daytime tasks gave rest for tired bodies. The same Lord who heard hymns in chapel also heard the quiet breathing of those who slept. After a while, Elias lifted his basket. "I should let you have your supper before it cools." Mrs. Whitaker smiled. "And you should have yours before the night grows too late." She reached toward the table and took one small wrapped parcel from beside the bowl. "I saved you a little apple tart. It is not as fine as I used to make, but it is still sweet enough." Elias accepted it with gratitude. "You are very kind." "So are you," she said. At the door, Elias paused. The candle on the table burned steadily behind him, and Mrs. Whitaker stood in its glow, smaller now than she had once been, but bright with a quiet strength. "May your evening be peaceful," he said. "And yours," she replied. "May God give you rest when your work is done." He stepped outside and gently closed the door. The night air met him cool and fresh. For a moment, he stood on the doorstep beneath the pear tree, breathing in the scent of grass, smoke, and the faint sweetness of fruit. Through the window, he could see the candle he had just lit. Its flame trembled once, then steadied, shining beside Mrs. Whitaker's table. Elias felt a deep tenderness for that small square of light. It did not push back the whole night. It did not need to. It simply made one room feel safe. He walked back through the gate and onto the lane, now carrying a lighter basket and a fuller heart. Above him, the stars had multiplied, scattered across the sky like quiet promises. The moon rested over the fields, pale and calm, and the village behind him glowed softly from its many windows. Elias thought of Mrs. Whitaker, naming her blessings before supper. Soup, shawl, moon, footsteps. He began to name his own as he walked. A good day's work, warm bread waiting at home, the apple in his pocket, honey cake in the basket, an apple tart wrapped with care, a candle in a widow's window, the peace of God, gentle enough to enter the smallest cottage, strong enough to hold every lonely heart. The road curved back toward the village square, and Elias followed it slowly, letting the quiet deepen around him. Somewhere in the distance, a dog barked once and then settled. A curtain moved behind a lit window. Leaves whispered overhead. Nothing hurried, nothing pressed upon him. The night seemed to invite every creature to rest in its proper place. And as Elias walked beneath the wide evening sky, he felt that he too was being guided home, not only by moonlight on the road, but by the tender faithfulness of God, who had been present in every doorway, every small kindness, every candle flame, and every peaceful breath of the day. By the time Elias reached the village square again, the night had settled fully, Not heavily, but gently, like a soft wool blanket drawn over the shoulders of the world. The old chestnut tree stood quiet beside the well, its leaves barely moving now, and the lantern near the path glowed with a patient yellow light. The square, which had been full of footsteps and voices during the day, now seemed to be listening to itself. The stones held the coolness of evening. The well rope hung still. A few windows around the square shone with candlelight, and from behind one of them came the low murmur of a family finishing supper. Elias slowed his steps, not because he was tired, though his feet did welcome the thought of home, but because there was a tenderness in the air that asked not to be passed too quickly. He could feel a change in the weather before the first drop fell. The air had become softer, carrying a damp sweetness from the fields, and the moon, which had been clear above the rooftops, now seemed to glow through a thin veil of cloud. Elias looked upward. The stars were fading behind a wide gray drift moving slowly across the sky. It would rain soon, but not in a harsh way. The clouds came without thunder, without sharp wind, without any sense of trouble. They came like a quiet visitor, bringing rest to the roofs, the gardens, the empty roads, and the tired earth. Elias tucked the cloth more carefully over his basket, though only a few parcels remained inside now: the honey cake, the apple tart, and the apple Mrs. Harris had given him. He smiled at the thought of such small gifts gathered from the evening. He had set out carrying candles, and he was returning with sweetness. The first raindrop touched his sleeve just as he turned down the lane toward his shop. Then another fell on the back of his hand, cool and light. Soon the rain began to whisper over the village, a thin silver sound on rooftops, leaves, fences, and stone. It did not hurry him. If anything, it made him walk more slowly, because the whole world had suddenly become more peaceful. The road darkened slightly beneath the rain, reflecting little trembles of candlelight from the cottage windows. A soft scent rose from the earth, clean and deep, mingling with smoke from the chimneys and the fading sweetness of evening bread. Elias lifted his face just enough to feel a few drops on his cheek, and he thought of all the gardens receiving this quiet gift. The herbs behind his shop, the pear tree outside Mrs. Whitaker's cottage, the fields beyond the chapel, and the old paths that would be fresh by morning. By the time he reached his shop door, the rain had become steady, but still gentle. The little bell above the door rang softly as he stepped inside, and the familiar warmth of the room welcomed him. The candle he had left near the window still burned low and calm, its flame bending slightly as the door opened, then settling again when he closed it behind him. For a moment, Elias stood just inside, listening to the rain tapping against the glass. The shop looked different at night. The shells of candles, the wooden counter, the jars of herbs, the rolls of wick, and the old tools all seemed quieter, as though they too had finished their work and were ready to rest. The air held the faint scent of cooled wax, lavender, and the bread still waiting on the side shelf. Elias removed his coat and hung it near the stove, then placed the basket on the table. He checked the wax pot first, as he always did, making sure all was safe and cool. Then he trimmed the candle by the window so the flame would remain small and clean. His movements were slow, familiar, and untroubled. There was no hurry now. The deliveries were done. The village had received its little lights. The old widow's table was glowing. The chapel had candles for morning, and windows across the lane were warm. The day had completed itself, not with noise or triumph, but with a gentle sense of enough. He took the bread from the shelf and carried it through the narrow doorway into the small room behind the shop where he lived. It was a plain room, but dear to him. A table stood near the window, polished by years of use. A small hearth sat against the wall, with a pot ready for soup. There was a simple chair, a narrow bed with a folded quilt, a shelf of books, a cup, a plate, and a small wooden cross carved by his father long ago. Near the back door, a bundle of rosemary hung drying from a beam, filling the room with its quiet, clean fragrance. Elias lit another candle and placed it at the center of the table. The flame opened gently, touching the loaf of bread with gold, shining on the worn grain of the wood, and reaching softly toward the window where rain was now tracing little rivers down the glass. He warmed a bowl of soup over the hearth, stirring it slowly, while the room filled with the comforting smell of carrots, onions, herbs, and broth. Outside, the rain continued its steady song. It fell on the roof, tapped the window, brushed the garden, and gathered in small drops along the sill. Elias found great peace in rain at night, especially when he was indoors with a candle lit and something warm for supper. It reminded him that the world could be cared for while people rested. The gardens drank. The dust settled. The roofs were washed. The fields were renewed in silence. No one had to command the rain or guide each drop to its place. God knew how to water the earth. God knew how to tend what people could not tend while they slept. When the soup was ready, Elias sat at the table and bowed his head. His prayer was quiet, almost a whisper beneath the sound of rain. Lord, thank you for this day. Thank you for work, for neighbors, for bread, for kindness given and kindness received. Bless the homes of this village tonight. Let every heart that is tired find rest in your care. He paused, not searching for more words. Some prayers were best left simple. Then he added, and thank you for being near. The words settled into the room gently, and Elias opened his eyes. He ate slowly, breaking the bread into small pieces and dipping it into the warm soup. The meal was simple, but it tasted rich with gratitude. He thought of the baker's wife and her flour-dusted hand lifted in greeting. He thought of Mrs. Harris placing an apple in his pocket. He thought of the grandmother giving honey cake, and Mrs. Whitaker wrapping the apple tart for him. Each gift had been small, yet together they seemed like a feast of kindness. Elias placed the apple, the honey cake, and the tart on the table beside his bowl. Not to eat them all at once, but simply to see them there. They reminded him that no life was truly solitary when it was woven into love. Even a quiet man who lived behind a candle shop could carry the warmth of many homes back to his own table. After supper, he washed his bowl and cup, then returned to the table with the small piece of honey cake. He ate half of it slowly, smiling at its sweetness, and saved the rest for morning. The rain had grown a little fuller now, but still peaceful. It made the room feel sheltered, as though the whole cottage were a lantern set safely in the dark. Elias pulled his chair closer to the window and watched the candle flame reflected in the glass. Beyond that reflection, the lane was dim and shining. A few windows still glowed across the way, though one by one, they were beginning to darken as families prepared for sleep. There was a great kindness, Elias thought, in the way night arrived, little by little. It did not demand that everything stop at once. It allowed the day to loosen. It gave time for supper, for washing bowls, for folding cloth, for checking doors, for quiet reading, for prayers spoken beside beds, for children to grow drowsy, for old people to rest their hands. The night was not empty. It was full of small endings, and each ending could be received gently. Even the candle on his table seemed to understand this, burning not brightly, but steadily, offering just enough light for the hour. Elias reached for the Bible on the shelf and opened it, not with the intention of reading much, but only of letting a few familiar words rest in his heart before sleep. His eyes moved over the page slowly. He did not hurry the sentences. He let them come to him the way rain came to the window, softly, steadily, without force. The words reminded him of peace, of trust, of the Lord who watches and keeps. He rested his hand on the open page for a moment, feeling the old paper beneath his fingers. Many evenings had found him this way. Alone at the table, but not lonely. Tired, but not troubled. Quiet, but not empty. The presence of God did not always feel like a strong emotion. Sometimes it felt like being able to sit still. Sometimes it felt like having enough light to read by. Sometimes it felt like knowing that the day, with all its small tasks and small kindnesses, had been seen. The rain softened again, becoming a delicate tapping, like fingertips on the roof. Elias leaned back in his chair and closed his eyes for a moment. He listened carefully, as though each sound were part of a gentle hymn. Rain on glass, fire settling in the hearth, candle flame breathing faintly, wood cooling in the walls, his own breath quiet and slow. He imagined the village under the rain, Mrs. Whitaker reading by her candle, the miller coming home to the light in his window, the young mother feeding her baby beside a small flame. The farmer sitting in the barn with his weak sheep, one of Elias's thick candles burning nearby. The chapel waiting in silence for morning. The schoolroom dark now, but ready for children and lessons when the day returned. All these places, all these lives, held beneath the same rain, beneath the same night, beneath the same faithful care of God. A deep peace came over Elias then. Not dramatic, not sudden, but quiet and complete. He did not need to understand everything about his life. He did not need to know what tomorrow would bring, whether business would be good, whether the weather would hold, whether his hands would ache less or more by evening. Tomorrow belonged to God already. Tonight, he had only to receive rest. Tonight, he had only to be thankful. Tonight, the rain was enough, the candle was enough, the bread had been enough, and grace had been more than enough. He opened his eyes and looked again at the candle. The flame stood calm, surrounded by a small circle of golden light. Beyond that circle, the room faded into soft shadow, but the shadows did not feel cold. They were gentle, like folded wings. Elias thought of how often people wished for the whole path to be bright, when perhaps God, in kindness, gave light in smaller portions, so the heart could learn to trust. A candle did not show the whole road. It showed the table, the chair, the next step, the page before the eyes, the face of a friend, the bowl of soup, the hands folded in prayer. And often, that was exactly the light a person needed. The rain continued, blessing the roofs and gardens of the village, while Elias sat quietly in his little room behind the shop. He felt the day sinking peacefully into memory. He felt his own thoughts slowing, becoming softer and wider. He felt held, as surely as the candle was held by its simple wooden stand, as surely as the village was held beneath the rain, as surely as every sleeping bird was held in the branches outside. The Lord was near, near in the candlelight, near in the sound of rain, near in the humble work of the day, near in the silence that followed. And so Elias remained there a little longer, not asking for anything, not needing to speak, simply resting in the gentle truth that peace did not have to be earned before sleep. It could be received. It could be welcomed. It could fall softly over the heart, like rain over a quiet village, until every worry became less sharp, every breath became slower, and the soul remembered that it was safe in the care of God. The rain continued softly over the village, and Elias remained seated by the window for a little while longer, letting the quiet sounds of the night gather around him. The candle on the table had burned lower now, its golden circle smaller than before, but still steady and warm. Its light rested on the open Bible, the empty bowl, the folded cloth, and the half piece of honey cake saved carefully for morning. Outside the glass, rain slipped down in thin silver lines, blurring the shapes of the lane and the houses beyond it. Every now and then, a drop gathered on the edge of the window frame and fell into the darkness below. Elias watched without hurry. There was nothing more that needed to be done quickly. The work of the day had ended, the village had grown still, and even the rain seemed to be speaking in a voice meant for rest. He rose from his chair slowly and began to prepare the room for the night. First, he closed the Bible with gentle hands and placed the ribbon carefully between the pages. He did not mark a passage because he feared forgetting it. He marked it because he wanted to return to it with gratitude, the way one returns to a quiet garden path that has brought comfort before. Then, he carried the bowl and spoon to the wash basin, rinsed them clean, and set them upside down on a cloth to dry. These were simple movements, the kind done every evening. Yet Elias had always found peace in them. There was a kindness in routine. A bowl washed after supper, a table wiped, a chair pushed back into place, a hearth checked, a door latched gently. Each small act told the heart that the day was being laid down with care. The little room behind the shop glowed softly as he moved through it. The fire on the hearth had settled into embers, red and quiet beneath a thin covering of ash. Elias added one small piece of wood, not enough to make the room too warm, only enough to keep a gentle heat through the first hours of the night. The wood caught slowly, with a faint crackle, then steadied into a low flame. He stood before it for a moment, warming his hands and listening to the rain beyond the walls. He thought of the many homes in the village, each closing in its own peaceful way. Doors were being bolted. Children were being tucked beneath blankets. Mothers were smoothing hair from sleepy foreheads. Fathers were setting boots near the door for mourning. Grandmothers were folding shawls over chairbacks. Someone, somewhere, was whispering one final prayer before putting out the lamp. The village was not silent in emptiness. It was silent in trust. Elias walked into the candle shop once more to make sure everything was ready for morning. The room beyond the living quarters was darker now, lit only by the small candle near the window and the dim glow that came from behind him. The shelves stood in patient rows, holding the candles he had not sold that day. Tall tapers leaned together in bundles. Short kitchen candles waited in a wooden tray. A few unfinished wicks hung near the work table, ready to be dipped again when morning came. The scent of wax was cooler now, less sweet than it had been in the afternoon, mingled with the clean smell of rain slipping under the door. Elias touched the edge of the table, feeling the familiar marks in the wood, the little dents and scratches made by years of work. His father had used this table before him, and sometimes Elias felt comforted by that continuity. One generation made light for another. One pair of hands taught the next. One day followed another under the patient mercy of God. He trimmed the shop candle, then decided to let it burn a little longer. Its flame near the window was small enough to be safe in the deep holder, and Elias liked the thought that someone passing late in the rain might see it and feel, even for a moment, that the village was not entirely asleep to them. A traveler, a mill worker coming home late, or a neighbor glancing down the lane might notice that single glow and find it comforting. Elias had no need to know who would see it. Some blessings were meant to be left quietly in place, without asking whether they were noticed. Returning to his room, he took one fresh candle from the shelf near the doorway. It was not large, not polished for sale, not perfectly shaped. One side had a slight unevenness where the wax had cooled too quickly. Most customers would never notice it, and if they did, they would not mind. But Elias had kept it for himself because he liked imperfect things that still served their purpose. He set it in the wooden holder beside his bed and lit it from the candle on the table. The new flame trembled, caught, and rose. For a brief moment, there were two candles burning in the room, two small lights sharing the same quiet. Then Elias carried the table candle to the shelf and gently pinched it out with the little brass snuffer. The room dimmed, but it did not become dark. The bedside candle held enough light for everything that remained. Elias changed into his nightshirt and folded his clothes over the chair, placing his work apron neatly on top. The apron was marked with wax, and no washing could fully remove the pale stains from the fabric. He smiled faintly at that. Some marks were not signs of carelessness. Some were signs of faithfulness. They were reminders of labor offered day after day, of hands used honestly, of a calling lived in small ways. Elias thought that perhaps the soul carried such marks too, marks from loving, serving, waiting, forgiving, and beginning again. God saw them not as stains to be despised, but as part of the story of a life being shaped by grace. He sat on the edge of the bed and listened again. Rain on the roof, rain at the window, the soft breathing of the fire, the tiny whisper of the candle flame. The world had become very small and very peaceful. No distant news reached him here. No urgent voices called from the street. No burden asked to be solved before morning. Elias rested his hands on his knees and let his shoulders lower. He did not always notice how much he carried in his body until the night invited him to set it down. The weight of standing at the work table, the careful attention needed for melting wax, the memory of customers and orders, the quiet concern about enough coins for winter wood, the ache of old griefs that sometimes stirred without warning. All of it softened in the candlelight. He reached for the small Bible verse card, tucked into the frame beside his bed. It had been written long ago by his mother in a careful hand. The edges were worn, and the ink had faded, but he still knew the words by heart. The Lord will watch over your coming and going, both now and forevermore. He held the card gently and let the words move through him slowly. Coming and going, morning and evening, opening the shop and closing it, walking out with a basket and returning in the rain, visiting neighbors and resting alone. God had watched over all of it, not from far away, not with cold distance, but with tender nearness. Elias placed the card back in its place and breathed a small prayer of thanks. The candle beside the bed burned with a quiet, unwavering glow. Elias watched it for a while, noticing how the flame was never truly still, yet never troubled. It moved lightly within itself, rising, bending, straightening, shining. Perhaps peace was like that, he thought. Not a life without movement, not a heart that never felt sorrow or uncertainty, but a steady trust held in the center of it all. The rain moved, the shadows moved, the flame moved, and yet the room remained peaceful. God did not ask the heart to become stone before it could rest. He only invited it to be held. Elias lay back against the pillow, pulling the quilt over himself. The quilt was old, stitched from pieces of fabric saved over many years. A square from one of his mother's dresses, a dark piece from his father's coat, a bit of blue cloth from a shirt Elias had worn when he was younger, and other pieces whose stories he no longer remembered. In the candlelight, the quilt looked soft and shadowed, a patchwork of ordinary life. Elias rested one hand on it and thought of how God gathered days together in much the same way. Bright days, difficult days, busy days, lonely days, rainy evenings, gentle visits, small meals, quiet prayers, all stitched into something warmer than any single piece could be on its own. He did not fall asleep immediately, and he did not mind. There was a gentle kind of wakefulness that sometimes came before sleep, when the mind was no longer working hard, but simply drifting through gratitude. Elias thought again of Mrs. Whitaker's candle burning beside her supper. He imagined the miller stepping through his door and seeing the light his wife had placed for him. He imagined the young mother moving softly beside the cradle, the little bedside candle helping her care for the baby without disturbing the house. He imagined the schoolroom, dark now but ready, and the chapel candles waiting in their box for the morning. He imagined the farmer in his barn, perhaps still awake, speaking softly to the weak sheep while one thick candle burned beside the stall. All over the village, little lights were serving quietly. None of them knew the whole story of the rooms they entered. They simply burned where they were placed. That thought comforted Elias deeply. A person did not need to understand the whole shape of their life to be faithful within it. A candle did not ask why it had been set on this table rather than another. It did not compare its flame to the moon or the stars. It simply gave what it had been made to give. Elias closed his eyes for a moment and felt those words become a prayer in him. Lord, help me give the light you have placed in me, simply and gently, where I am, outside. The rain began to slow. The tapping on the window grew lighter, with longer spaces between each drop. Somewhere in the distance, water ran softly along the edge of the lane. The clouds must have thinned because a pale brightness entered the room, almost hidden beneath the candlelight. Elias opened his eyes and saw a faint wash of moonlight across the floor. It mingled with the small flame beside his bed, silver and gold resting together in the quiet. He smiled sleepily. The candle and the moon did not compete. Each gave light in its own way. One from near, one from far. One small enough to hold in a hand, one wide enough to soften the whole sky. Both were gifts. His thoughts slowed further. He felt the warmth of the quilt, the softness of the pillow, the safety of the room, the shelter of the roof, the nearness of the Lord. He thought of all the things he did not have to hold through the night. He did not have to keep the stars in place. He did not have to tell the rain where to fall. He did not have to watch every home, mend every sorrow, answer every question, or prepare tomorrow before it came. God was already awake in ways Elias could not be. God was already caring for the village, for the fields, for the sleeping children, for the lonely, for the weary, for the animals in barns, for travelers on roads, and for every quiet heart beneath the rain-washed sky. The candle beside his bed had burned lower, and its light had grown even softer. Elias knew he should put it out before sleep, but he waited just a little longer, resting in the hush. The flame made a small halo on the wall and touched the wooden cross with a dim, golden edge. That sight filled him with peace. Not a sharp peace, not a loud joy, but something deeper and calmer, like still water under moonlight. He felt loved in a way that did not demand anything from him at that moment. Loved when his work was done. Loved when his hands were empty. Loved when he had no words left to offer. Loved simply because he belonged to God. At last, Elias reached for the brass snuffer on the bedside table. Before he used it, he whispered, "Thank you, Lord, for the light of this day. Keep us through the night." Then he lowered the snuffer over the flame. The room fell into darkness, but not into fear. Moonlight still rested faintly at the window, and the embers still breathed in the hearth. More than that, the peace that had filled the room did not leave when the candle went out. It remained around him, unseen but sure, like the gentle presence of God. Elias settled beneath the quilt and let his eyes close. The rain had nearly stopped. The village slept. The candles he had made were burning or waiting in homes all around him. And in the quiet after the flame, Elias felt the sweetest truth of the evening. Even when every candle is put out, the care of God remains. It shines without smoke, without sound, without end. It watches over the sleeping village, over the fields and rooftops, over the little shop and the tired candlemaker within it. And held in that peaceful care, Elias breathed slowly, deeply, and began to drift towards sleep. The village rested beneath the quiet night, and all along the narrow lanes, the last sounds of the day had faded into stillness. The rain had stopped, leaving the rooftops dark and clean, the garden paths damp and shining, and the air fresh with the gentle scent of earth and leaves. A few drops still slipped from the eaves now and then, falling softly into the puddles below, but even that sound was slow and peaceful, like the final notes of a lullaby. Behind the windows of the village homes, candles burned low. Some flames watched over empty kitchen tables where supper bowls had already been washed and put away. Some glowed beside beds where children slept with their hands tucked beneath their cheeks. Some rested near chairs where old hands had folded in prayer before the day was surrendered to God. And in Elias's little shop, all was quiet. The work tables stood in shadow. The shelves of candles waited for morning. The small bell above the door hung still, and the room smelled faintly of wax, lavender, rain, and the warmth of a life lived gently. Elias lay beneath his quilt, breathing slowly, feeling sleep come nearer with each passing moment. He was not thinking in full thoughts anymore, but in soft impressions. The glow of Mrs. Whitaker's candle, the sound of rain on the window, the apple in his coat pocket, the quiet chapel under moonlight, the faces of neighbors receiving their small lights for the evening. The whole day seemed to gather itself into one simple truth. God had been near. Near in the shop, near on the lane, near in the cottage doorway, near in the rain, near in the silence after the candle was put out. Elias did not need to hold tightly to the day any longer. It had been received, lived, and given back. The joys, the work, the small worries, the kindnesses, the memories, the prayers, all of it rested now in hands greater and gentler than his own. Outside, the clouds slowly parted, and the moon looked down upon the village with a pale and tender light. It touched the chapel roof, the old chestnut tree beside the well, the pear tree near the widow's cottage, the mill by the stream, and the little candle shop at the bend in the lane. No one needed to see it for it to be beautiful. No one needed to thank it for it to shine. It simply poured its quiet brightness over the sleeping world, the way God's mercy often comes to tired hearts, freely, softly, without asking them to earn it. Elias felt that mercy in the deep calm of the room. He felt it in the warmth of the quilt, in the shelter of the roof, in the slowing rhythm of his breath. He felt it as a peace that did not need explanation. And now, as the night grew deeper, let this quiet prayer rise gently, not only from Elias's room, but from every peaceful home, every tired heart, and every listener ready to rest. Dear Lord, Chap-Chop, thank you for this day that has now come to its gentle end. Chap-Chop, thank you for the morning light, for the work of our hands, for the people who crossed our path, and for every small blessing we may have noticed or forgotten. Thank you for bread on the table, for warmth in a room, for rain upon the earth, for candlelight in the evening, and for the quiet ways you remind us that we are not alone. As this night settles around us, help our hearts become still. Let every worry grow soft in your presence. Let every heavy thought loosen its hold. Let every tired breath find peace in your care. Lord, bless every home tonight. Bless those who are sleeping peacefully, and bless those who find it hard to rest. Bless the lonely with comfort, the weary with strength, the anxious with calm, and the grateful with deeper joy. Let your love be near to every person who feels small, unseen, or tired from the day. Remind them gently that they are known by you, held by you, and never forgotten. Cover this night with your peace. Watch over the quiet streets, the sleeping children, the old and the young, the homes full of voices, and the rooms where someone rests alone. Let there be safety beneath every roof, kindness in every heart, and hope waiting softly for the morning. Thank you, Lord, that we do not need to finish everything before we sleep. We do not need to understand every question, solve every problem, or carry tomorrow before it comes. Tonight, we can lay our burdens down. Tonight, we can trust that you are still caring, still watching, still holding the world together in love. Like a candle burning gently in a dark room, let your peace shine within us. Not loudly, not with fear, but with a steady and tender light. Let that light remind us that grace is enough for this moment. Rest is a gift, and your love remains even when our eyes close. As we drift towards sleep, fill our hearts with quiet gratitude. For the simple things, for the soft things, for the small blessings that made today brighter, for a kind word, a warm meal, a safe place, a peaceful breath, a remembered prayer, a gentle light. Forgive what needs forgiving, heal what needs healing, and calm what needs calming. Let this night be a place of rest, not only for the body, but for the soul. And when morning comes, may we wake with a little more peace, a little more kindness, and a little more trust in your faithful care. In your loving name, amen. The prayer faded into silence, but the peace of it remained. The village slept beneath the moon, wrapped in the calm after rain. The candles in the windows burned low, one by one, and the night held them gently. Elias's breathing became slow and even, his hands resting open beneath the quilt. He had carried light through the village, and now he rested in a greater light, one that did not flicker, one that did not fade, one that watched over him with endless tenderness. And so the little candle maker slept, safe in the quiet care of God, while the stars shone softly above the rooftops, and the whole world seemed to whisper, "Rest now, beloved. Rest now in peace."